let's go ahead and bring in Chris Mannix, who we last talked to when the NBA was completing its season in October. But with the big trade that went on yesterday, I thought we needed to get him to assess how things have been going as we're about, 12 or 15% through the NBA's regular season so far. How crazy was this trade? Do you think that Brooklyn and Steve Nash in particular is going to be able to hold together Harden, Durant, and Kyrie through this season?
Well, it's a challenge, that's for sure. And any conversation about the Nets has to be viewed through the prism of not having any idea what Kyrie's future is going to be. He missed his fourth game this week. There's an expectation internally he'll miss at least 5 and 6. And then with the appearance of this video that purports to show Kyrie at a birthday party over the last few days without a mask on, suddenly he goes into the NBA protocols, and it could be even longer for him to be out of the lineup. So, that's one part of it. I do think, though, if you want to look at it in the big picture way, it's the right move to make if you're the Nets. Look, a couple of years ago, Kawhi Leonard was a disgruntled player in San Antonio with no interest in playing in Toronto. They went on to win a championship. Things can change. We can probably all agree that how James Harden got to this point was fairly despicable. Kind of just quitting on his team throughout the season. But here we are. He's in a situation with a former teammate in a city he wants to play in. I fully expect a James Harden revival over the next few months. And in the playoffs, Clay, when you have guys that can score on their own, you win. It's as simple as that. The NBA is a star-driven league, and now the Nets, on paper, have the first big three since Durant left Golden State.
Okay, the NBA gives a lot of leniency to players. As you just mentioned, it's a star-driven league. It's a player-driven league. But even within that star construct, and even with that leniency, it seems like a lot of guys are rolling their eyes about what's going on with Kyrie Irving in terms of where he is and why he's not with his team. What do we know about why he's not there, at least what he's told the Nets? And what are you hearing in the league about perceptions and opinions on the way Kyrie is behaving?
Yeah, look, the Nets know why he's not with them. They're not sharing it, and I'm a little reluctant to speculate on a guy leaving for personal reasons, though, there are some tea leaves you can read to kind of figure out some stuff there with Kyrie and how he feels about the political climate right now. It's something that the Nets are going to continue to treat with kid gloves, not because they're okay with all this or they're not starting to get frustrated by all this. Their public statements, as minimal as they've been, have kind of indicated that. But they're just not going to be willing to sabotage what could be a championship season over, 5 or 6 games in the month of January. They're frustrated. I think Kevin Durant is probably starting to get a little bit frustrated, and you can certainly make the argument that the Nets decided to devote as many draft picks as they did, in part because of the uncertainty around Irving and, to a lesser degree, the absence of Spencer Dinwiddie, who's done for the rest of the season. You have Harden and Durant just by themselves. You're in a position to win just like that. Irving, I don't want to say it becomes ancillary, but it's almost like icing on the cake with a team like that. So it's starting to reach, I don't want to call it a boiling point, but it's starting to get up there in temperature. But the Nets, from what I'm told, have made it clear that they're going to ride this thing out because they believe with a healthy and happy Kyrie Irving, they're a championship threat.
Does this destroy even more the NBA brand? Because I started off the show saying, regardless of what is going on in your life, there aren't very many people who are going to be sympathetic for Kyrie Irving making $40 million or whatever a year he is, just deciding not to show up at all for work. Particularly, I think that's any time for fans out there, because typically what fans value is work ethic, hard work. And it's even more, I would argue, the case now when so many people are unemployed, when so many people are struggling. And I would imagine even in the NBA, there are a lot of people looking at Kyrie Irving and saying, How does this guy just leave and just decide he doesn't want to play? He's potentially partying with Drake. He's showing up for Zoom calls for political related issues. I mean, it's always a bad look, I think, but this is like a next level bad look for Kyrie Irving.
I would agree. Whatever it is he's going through on a personal level, that's one thing. But to show up, as you said, on camera, on video, at a party, and then there was that kind of bizarre, I don't know if it was a fundraiser or whatever it was on Zoom for a political candidate, which I believe, if the timelines match up, was during a Nets game.
Yes,
that was going on. So these are all just bad looks, which Kyrie is going to have to explain to his teammates. I mean, forget the media. I'm sure, Clay, in the next 2 weeks, it's going to be the media's fault. It will wind up being our fault for writing about it and not understanding where his plight and all that. It always winds up that way. But he's going to have to explain to the coaching staff, to his teammates, and get them back on board with his commitment to the franchise. And I think the one player whose reactions and responses you have to watch is Kevin Durant. I mean, Durant, he could have played anywhere. He could have signed with anybody, even with that Achilles tear. Anybody would have given him the max, including Golden State, to bring him back to play with Steph, Clay, and Draymond and those guys. He chose Brooklyn. He chose Kyrie Irving because he believed that he and Kyrie would be a great fit. Durant is not giving any kind of indications that his frustration level is boiling over at this point, but he now has his ex-buddy, James Harden, his former Oklahoma City teammate, his USA basketball teammate, a former MVP, now in the mix as his running buddy. I wonder over the next couple of weeks if Kyrie's absence continues, does Durant's mindset on that relationship change?
What do we know about Steve Nash's ability to manage all these different superstar egos? And the reason why I ask is it seems to me so much of the NBA, and I think coaching in general as guys have made more and more money, but particularly in the NBA, is about being able to reach people who don't need to be reached. And what I mean by that is these guys are all set for life. And figuring out a way to motivate them is ultimately what distinguishes a okay coach from a great coach. Phil Jackson is a fantastic example. He was able to reach Shaq. He was able to reach Kobe. He was able to reach Jordan and Pippen and Rodman and everybody else on those eccentric level Bulls teams. It seems like Steve Kerr has been able to do the same thing with managing a lot of the challenges associated with egos with the Warriors. And maybe he learned from Phil Jackson. Maybe he learned from playing with Michael and Scottie back in the day. Steve Nash obviously has played with a lot of big superstars over his career. He won a couple of MVPs himself, but he never really had that superstar aura, I think because he came in from Santa Clara, Canadian. He was always trying to prove that he belonged in the league as opposed to being a superstar from the minute he entered the league. Can he manage these superstars? Does he have the wherewithal as a first-year head coach to pull it off?
The short answer is we don't know. I mean, we just don't know enough, about Steve Nash's temperament, his coaching acumen, how he handles locker rooms to be able to answer that with any kind of honesty in a situation like this. I mean, look, you mentioned Phil and you mentioned Steve Kerr. I think a better analogy here for Nash is going to be Eric Spoelstra. Yeah, I mean, look, LeBron James came to Miami after being catered to for like 7 years in Cleveland. Like it was his show down there. And Eric Spoelstra, to his credit, and with the full backing of Pat Riley, said, we don't do things like that down here. You are coached down here. And you know what? LeBron benefited greatly from that. He described his 4 years in Miami as being like a college-like education of basketball. James Harden is a similar type of player. He has spent the last 7 years being catered to down in Houston, having an offense built entirely around him, having teammates being brought in at his whim. How Steve Nash handles Harden and how he's able to kind of figure out that relationship will determine how successful the Nets are. There are certainly other variables to all this, but that's one I'm watching closest. Look, Durant has a previous relationship with Nash from Golden State. He was on board with all this. Kyrie said the right things, but Harden doesn't know Nash from anywhere, from anyone. What kind of attitude he comes in with and how Nash is able to navigate that, That's something I'm watching really closely.
How good of a relationship do Harden and Kevin Durant have? They were obviously teammates in Oklahoma City. What do you know about their interactions, their chemistry?
It's pretty strong. And Harden was one of those players that didn't burn any bridges on his way out of town. It wasn't a, Durant-Westbrook situation. Harden left not because he didn't like his role, but because Oklahoma City wouldn't pay him. And that's been well chronicled over the years as one of the big mistakes the Thunder made in that kind of Durant-Westbrook-Harden era. But he's maintained, up until last year, a really strong relationship with Westbrook. He's maintained a pretty strong relationship with Durant. I mentioned they were USA Basketball teammates for a cycle. I think that is a positive for the Nets that these two guys come in with a pre-existing relationship. But again, there's only one basketball. James Harden is one of the highest usage rate players in NBA history. Kevin Durant, if you've watched him, looks like the MVP from a few years ago. Irving is a high-scoring guard. This is not going to be easy. Like getting these guys on the same page and developing the kind of chemistry you need to beat the Milwaukees, the Miamis, the Bostons in the Eastern Conference, much less the Lakers in an NBA Finals.
Should they be considered the favorite in your mind, the Nets?
In the East, right now, on
Yes.
paper, yes. I think the Lakers, to me, still are still the favorite for everything else.
Okay, so if the Nets are the favorites in the East, the Lakers are the favorites in the West. What should we know or need to know about the Lakers and LeBron this year since we last saw them in October?
I mean, they're better because their roster is a little bit better. Dennis Schroeder is the right fit for that team. I mean, they're just on cruise control right now. I mean, you saw LeBron the other night, doing the Steph Curry three-point turnaround, just embarrassing the Rockets in that game. Like the front court changes have not adversely affected them. Marc Gasol's been okay. Everything else is status quo. I mean, Anthony Davis looks like the defensive player of the year. LeBron is an early favorite for MVP. They haven't been impacted by COVID at all, I think, up until this point. So everything has been, quiet on Lakers front. That's a good thing because they're just rolling along this early in the season.
Do you believe that the NBA is going to have to stop the season because certainly they're adjusting their COVID protocols on the fly? First part. Second part, is there any possibility that when the postseason gets here, another bubble is instituted?
I don't believe they'll stop the season unless there is a proliferation of teams impacted by COVID-19. I think that right now there's only about 5 or 6 hotspots that have emerged in the NBA. If that number grows to 12 or 15, then I think it's a different conversation. But right now the league is focused on, tweaking those rules and pushing through. The playoffs are a different story, though. If we're in the same place in April where you've got, these hotspots flaring up and we're not down the road with a vaccine enough to get these guys vaccinated in May and early June, I think then we will see a bubble being explored. I think the NBA is going to protect the integrity of the playoffs at all costs. You got to remember too, the NBA, they announced 16 positive tests. That's a much bigger number than they had the week before. But what's killing the NBA is contact tracing.
Right.
These guys are one of the reasons they made these rules effectively, forcing guys to stay in while at home and on the road is that they can't have one guy test positive and 6 guys go out. It's just less a health issue than it is a issue that their own rules prevent them from letting these guys play.
Chris Mannix, Sports Illustrated. Appreciate you getting up early with us, breaking this down. Anything else we should know about the NBA so far this season that I didn't ask you about?
No, eventually games will be played, I think. We'll stop having so many, postponements, and hopefully we'll get back on track.
Good stuff. Appreciate it, my man. We'll talk to you again soon.